Coming up on this edition of the Black Vault Radio, recent statements by the United States Navy allude to new UFO reporting guidelines being implemented. Based on reports by military pilots in recent years, unidentified aircraft are causing security concern and aviation hazards that need to be addressed. Join me as I connect the phrasing used by the Navy going back 66 years. And I'll explore Air Force regulations already on the books that outline the very same thing. What does this all mean? That's coming up on the Black Vault Radio. More than 20 years ago, I began a journey, my quest for the truth. My name is John Greenewald, and I have hammered the United States government with Freedom of Information Act requests trying to get answers. I have more than 2 million pages of declassified documents for you to download at theblackvault.com. Now, I attempt to dive even deeper and talk to some of the most brilliant minds on this planet. No government secret is off limits, and no question is off the table. All I aim for is the truth. This is the Black Vault Radio. That's right, everybody. This is the Black Vault Radio. I am your host, John Greenewald Jr. As always, thank you so much for tuning in and making this your podcast and radio show of choice. I hope you listened to the last episode with David Aguilar. Wow, was that an amazing conversation for me to have. I will totally be honest with you right now. I kind of geeked out about that whole thing. So if you haven't had an opportunity to listen to it, definitely do so. That's episode number 30. It was my one-on-one with world-renowned astronomer, scientist, David Aguilar, and it was an amazing conversation. So make sure you tune into that. If this is your first time tuning into the Black Vault Radio, welcome. If you are not aware, I have a show notes page which breaks down everything that I talk about, not only on this program, but all others, including links to where you can listen to all other programs. That's located at www.theblackvault.com/show notes. Now, if you did listen to episode number 30 with David Aguilar, I made reference in the very beginning that I started recording the introduction to that show and realized there was so much to go over with the news of now last week with the Navy protocols or guidelines for UFOs. I thought, you know what, out of respect for everyone's time, let's just go ahead and separate that news and those updates, because I have a really cool update for you all. Sorry to kind of tease you with it and say that the episode was going to drop the same day. It ended up not doing so, and here we are a couple days after, through the weekend and on a Monday. I do apologize for that. I have a 6-month-old baby and a 5-year-old toddler, and wow, nothing ever goes as planned. So Friday, daddy duty kind of took over a little bit earlier than expected. So not to make excuses for you, but my family does come first for obvious reasons, of course. But I did want to get this show out to you and update you all, because even as of today, no media outlets are really reporting this, even in some of the other articles that I've seen pop up. And it is a very important update to the story of the Navy guidelines for UFOs. Now, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, last week was some pretty cool news that come around. This was all about the headline from Politico that dropped on the evening of April 23rd. Now, about 6 o'clock Eastern time, a headline was dropped onto Politico that read, U.S. Navy drafting new guidelines for reporting UFOs. The subheading reads, the service says it has also provided a series of briefings by senior naval intelligence officials as well as aviators who reported hazards to aviation safety. And then the article starts. Now, this was written by Mr. Brian Bender. If you don't know who that is, he's an investigative journalist who was responsible for the Politico story on To the Stars Academy, but more so about the ATIP program that broke in December of 2017. Now, we all know that the New York Times really is the one that's credited for the kind of the first and most important article. Now, I don't rank them in levels of importance personally, but again, that's really the one that was most well known in my opinion. But Politico deserves a lot of credit because they came out with one the exact same day. And Mr. Brian Bender was the author of that. Now, fast forward to April 23rd of this year, of 2019, he drops another story exclusive to Politico that was all about these Navy guidelines. Now, obviously, this is exciting and encouraging news because for quite a few years, in the tune of about 20 years, I have lectured and spoken quite openly about how the government and military documents that have come out and been declassified truly support that there is a threat to national security behind this UFO phenomena. Yes, the plural is intended on that. There's a threat there that they seemingly have not taken seriously. Now, I've talked a lot about this program. I've talked a lot about this on this program, and I've gone into some Air Force manuals and so on and so forth about UFOs. But after I had put the spotlight on it, it seemingly had just been covered up and disappeared. If you're not familiar with that story, that's Air Force Manual or Air Force Instruction 10-206. I'll link it in the show notes page so you can see that story. I'm not going to tell it again here. But I obviously wanted to use that as a point that this is something that's very important to me and I feel should be very important to society, where we should take this seriously. So reading this headline, I was really intrigued. Let me read the first line to you here. The U.S. Navy is drafting new guidelines for pilots and other personnel to report encounters with, quote, unidentified aircraft, unquote, a significant new step in creating a formal process to collect and analyze the unexplained sightings and destigmatize them. That was the first line of the Politico story by Mr. Brian Bender. Now, it kind of piqued my interest a little bit. The headline said one thing. The first paragraph said another. Now, before you tune out and think I'm just going to debunk this whole thing, stay tuned because that's not what I'm about to do. What I do, and let me preface this whole show and say this. For those who have not only read my book, but seen me do lectures and so on, the way that I approach investigations and research something is you can't always believe the first thing that you hear. You always have to challenge it. You always have to push back and look for corroborating evidence. That's always not a possibility, but it is something that we need to do. And it is something that we, as researchers and investigators, we have to challenge what we are told in a press statement or at a press conference, especially by the government and the military, but we have to challenge it. Because true research, you don't go in it with your mind already made up. You have to go in and start challenging and throwing things at the idea to see what sticks or what bounces back or what red flags arise. You do this for multiple reasons, because then you can start scratching off the list all of the potential explanations that skeptics can try and fire back at you. And I've done this quite a few times through different areas of research, UFOs being only one of them. But you take something that you might read, see, or hear and challenge it. And when I was 15 years old, that's exactly what I did when I approached the UFO topic. I was told one thing by the U.S. government, so I challenged it. And I went after evidence, and I got an overwhelming amount of it to disprove what the government was saying. Now, that's not true only with the government. What I mean by all of this is you have to challenge everything. You have to make sure that everything, what you're hearing and reading is correct. So I decided to challenge the headline, because does U.S. Navy drafting new guidelines for reporting UFOs coincide with the actual statement by the U.S. Navy referring to unidentified aircraft? Now, I know that sounds like semantics and who cares, it's all the same. It actually is an important note, because we want to make sure that things are not embellished. Now, again, don't tune out thinking I'm just going to debunk any or try to debunk something. Quite the contrary, there's quite a bit of research here. So let's dig in. So I read this article, And cobbling together from Politico, because I don't think they did 100% of the statement, but regardless, Washington Post also had published a statement from the U.S. Navy. And what they do in articles, if you haven't noticed, is they'll take the statement. They generally just don't run it from top to bottom. Sometimes statements are a paragraph. Sometimes they're a full page with 6 paragraphs. But here's the statement that I'll read in full. Now, this is as of the dropping of the Politico story. So that would be April 23rd. And then Washington Post, around the same time frame, I believe it was the next day, April 24. This is the full statement. There have been a number of reports of unauthorized and or unidentified aircraft entering various military-controlled ranges and designated airspace in recent years. For safety and security concerns, the Navy and the United States Air Force takes these reports very seriously and investigates each and every report. As part of this effort, the Navy is updating and formalizing the process by which reports of any such suspected incursions can be made to the cognizant authorities. A new message to the fleet that will detail the steps for reporting is in draft. In response to requests for information from congressional members and staff, Navy officials have provided a series of briefings by senior naval intelligence officials, as well as aviators who reported hazards to aviation safety. That is the entire statement. So, how can we kind of break this down a little bit? We want to make sure that the headline is exactly what we want it to be. UFOs, the phenomena that we know is there, that people are seeing both inside the military and out, that is truly what they mean. Or is this just more of a common sense thing? Of course, if you see an unidentified aircraft encroaching onto a military base, you will want to have procedures and guidelines to report it. Case in point, I received some declassified documents from the NCIS, or the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and they researched what we would call, UFO, something that was flying that we couldn't identify, encroachments on bases that mostly turned out to be drones. There were really nothing of note. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But my whole point is that the Navy actually has taken these seriously for quite some time. And even though they're very mundane explanations and nothing of worthy to spend a lot of time on, regardless, they have taken it seriously. So there's a couple ways to kind of approach this. Is it truly the phenomenon that they are interested in, the phenomena that we all know as UFOs, or is this just more of the common sense, like, hey, if you're flying an F-18 and you're on some mission and you see something that no one knows what it is, say something about it, don't hide it. So I wanted to kind of look back a little bit in history and figure out exactly, what this is all about. So I created a really big, kind of turned out to a really big article getting into that phrase of unidentified aircraft and how it connects to the UFO phenomena. And there are positive notes here. So please, again, don't think that I'm just trying to dismiss this entire story. On the contrary, I think these connections are fairly historically interesting and historically important. Now, the first thing I want to bring up, here I am saying I'm not going to, be a skeptic about this whole thing, is the Condon report. Now, obviously, even by me, this is a highly criticized report as they investigated UFOs and wanted to dissect what Project Blue Book at the time had collected. Now, this was a group of scientists and officials that got together at the University of Colorado. This was in 1966 when they convened, and it lasted until 68. They analyzed all of the UFO information that had come in, and they concluded a few things. Number one, that the UFO phenomena really wasn't real. The UFO phenomena didn't pose a threat to national security, and that the UFO phenomena did not warrant further scientific investigation. And so that was the overall nutshell conclusion of what that report was all about. But here's something that's very interesting on why I bring it up, because their conclusion is something I highly disagree with. So let me just put that up front. It's kind of a farce, and it deserves the criticism that it gets. However, on page 125 It specifically connects the flying saucers, is how they referred to it, with what they called unidentified aircraft. Now, what is the point here? This shows that the United States military and the verbiage at the time where we know they had a UFO project, a UFO research project that we now know as Project Blue Book, they connected the phrase of unidentified aircraft to the flying saucer phenomena. And it's in the same line, and I put screenshots on the article and so on, so you can see it. But it was an encouraging find, again, just getting into the terminology. Because going back to what I was saying earlier about how I approach research, not only do you want to challenge everything you hear, you also want to take into consideration what might be said by somebody to discredit what you are saying or what others are saying. In other words, you want to meet the skeptical response head on before it ever happens. It's something I've done since day one. Obviously, now in the recent year and a half, 2 years, I'm a little bit criticized for because I do ask questions and I do challenge, let's say, like To the Stars Academy or the stories about ATIP. But that's research, because if the truth is there, this is attributed to all topics. If you're researching something and the truth is there, challenging it will do nothing. If you try and discredit, that's something else. But if you challenge it and you ask important questions, when the answers come, if your hypothesis is still true, then those answers will do nothing but help. That's what the truth is all about. And so that's how I approach many of these topics. This specific one is no different. So that Condon report reference I thought was fairly interesting. But of course, those that know me, one document, one reference, one piece of evidence is never enough. So I started digging a little bit more and went into some historical documents from the CIA. Now, why this is important is we've now established a connection between that phrase and flying saucers, or again, UFOs, the way we want them to be referring to UFOs. But in 1953, a CIA document, there's quite a few others, but in the one I'll point out is from 1953, was detailing UFOs that were seen over Spain, Greece, and North Africa. Now, the intelligence report all went into flying saucers and various UFO encounters and this and that in those areas I mentioned. But in the intelligence report, what do you think the phrasing was in the subject that the CIA or the intelligence community chose? Unidentified aircraft. Not flying saucers or UFOs. Unidentified aircraft. Now, the content of the intelligence report, again, was on flying saucers, but the intelligence community put the subject line at the top of the report, unidentified aircraft. The heading to the intelligence read, unidentified aircraft reported over Spain, Greece, North Africa. So again, it now shows a link between that phrasing and the intelligence community. So not only the military was using it, but the IC as well. Yes, those are two different things. So that additional link was something that's very, very important to establish. But we're talking about documents that stretch back 66 years. So the question in my mind was, historically that is significant. But if unidentified aircraft really now is the phrase of the day, because there's been a lot of debate on whether they call UFOs, whether they call them UAPs or USOs or whatever the phenomena is going to be referred to as, whatever acronym they decide to choose, I think that is a very silly debate, but it is a debate right now nonetheless. So I thought, great, now that we've established a historical link between unidentified aircraft and flying saucers, or UFOs, the way you and I want it to be, let's figure out what else is there and hone in on that phrase, unidentified aircraft, if that's their phrase of the day. So there is something to be said that if you don't say UFO, and under the FOIA you request UFO information, well, if the same exact documents just phrased differently say unidentified aircraft, sometimes, depending upon how you word your request, that information will not be responsive and it will not be sent to you, so you'll be missing out. So I started digging in a little bit, and I started making some really interesting connections between that phrase and what's on the book. Now, the United States Air Force was highly criticized by some. Some took to the blogs, some took to social media, some went to article comments, that the Air Force was essentially behind. Why would they ignore the UFO phenomena and the Navy is leading the way. So they received a little bit of heat behind all of this, but actually it probably isn't warranted. So let me just give you a couple documents that I found that were already in the Black Vault, but also quite a few that were not, because this was kind of a new angle for me to approach the topic. The first thing I came across was the 45th Space Wing instruction, known as 13-201. Now, a lot of these documents I'm about to talk to you about are all about aviation safety. So it's the safety of the men and women that fly in the sky for the military, making sure that they are safe. And there are multiple ways to approach that safety, but this particular manual, and this is how it is described, one line anyway, it provides guidance and procedures for the safe operation of all airspace operations. So again, it's punching that aircraft safety very much like the Navy did in their official statement, going back to that Politico article, and later Washington Post, and now quite a few places have talked about it. But in this manual, one of the things under the supporting aircraft / air crew operations section talked about what to report. One line reads, report any unidentified aircraft within ER assigned airspace to Cape Control. Now, ER is Eastern Range. So the 45th Space Wing is located in Florida at Patrick Air Force Base. So also kind of an interesting connection there, being, a space wing and all. But that being said, this particular manual only did apply to what they call the Eastern Range, or that general vicinity in Florida around Patrick Air Force Base. But it is important nonetheless, because it shows that in 2014, and this manual is still on the books, it has not been rescinded, that the Air Force has been taking this seriously, in the exact same verbiage that the Navy had already mentioned it in Politico, for the exact same reasons that the Navy mentioned. So again, I go back to that criticism of the Air Force. It may not be warranted. But as I mentioned before, one piece of evidence doesn't work for me, so I kept digging a little bit. I came across Aviation Safety Programs Air Force Instruction 91-225. Now, in this particular document, this was all about Air Force Aviation Safety Programs, or what they referred to as ASP. Again, punching that safety thing. Now, there's something that's outlined in this document called the Line Operations Safety Audit, or LOSA. Now, this is referred to in the manual. Let me read the line. The LOSA process involves the collection of unidentified observations and the development of a consolidated report of trends and conclusions regarding day-to-day operations. Now, that doesn't say unidentified aircraft, but what it does is kind of gives a different spin. Again, it's all about the phrasing. So if there is truth to quote-unquote them, the powers that be are changing the verbiage, well, we can't just lock ourselves into quote-unquote unidentified aircraft. So now this particular document from 2015, also still on the books, actually applies to the Air Force as a whole, not just a certain region. And they're talking about unidentified observations. But what's also key about this is that they're consolidating all of those observations into a report looking for trends. That's how I read that. I'll let you decide on what exactly that means. But the question is, does that mean that they have created a database of unidentified observations that United States Air Force pilots cannot identify? Now, I'll read the next line. This report may identify hazard or trends warranting further investigation. Now, that's pretty interesting that the United States Air Force has this on the books, agency-wide. Now, of course, this is something that I call FOIA fodder, and you better put money down that I'm going after documents relating to this, because this was a new find on my part. I'd not really seen this before at all, but connecting it historically again to that phrasing, and if that's how the Navy is approaching it, the Air Force is probably doing the same exact thing. So that is definitely a worthy document to note. Now, going back a little bit farther from 2015 when that manual was, I want to talk to you about 2007. Now, this was, March of 2007. There was a press release by Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska. Now, the reason why this is important is this actually goes back to the unidentified aircraft phrasing. And there was an operation that was underway. It was a training op off the coast of Alaska. And by the way, Elmendorf is part of the NORAD installation. So again, that agency that looks at space. That's an interesting coincidence. And the whole point of this operation was to train on how to intercept unidentified aircraft. They actually put an official definition in the press release on what unidentified aircraft meant. So let me read that to you. An unidentified aircraft is defined as any aircraft approaching American or Canadian airspace that is not on an international flight plan or has, without air traffic control authorization, deviated from its original flight plan. Any aircraft considered unidentified is investigated. Now, that's an important line there because this is from an Air Force base talking about unidentified aircraft. Now, I don't care how do you refer to it as, it's all kind of the same thing, but these are incredibly important links to this entire story of unidentified aircraft and unidentified observations, especially when military exercises are underway to intercept said unidentified aircraft. Now, does that mean that they are Russian fighters or spy planes that are operating off the coast of Alaska? Probably. But what else, quite possibly, are they training for? And that therein lies the question here of what we are talking about. Is this just a response to Russian aggression or to the North Koreans not playing nice in the sandbox all the time or whatever? Or is this code for something else entirely? Now, as a researcher, I can't rule out any of that. It all could be true. It could be a coincidence. Who knows? But regardless, that's why these pieces of information are important. Now, one of the other things that I dug into was the commercial side, not just the military side. And there was a really interesting coincidence here, which I thought was kind of fun, but, just more so in a geeky way for myself. But this goes back to 2005 in the FAA. Now, obviously, the FAA is instrumental in aviation safety for the commercial side. So we've already talked about military and the safety there. But I thought, well, what about the FAA? Maybe they have similar verbiage. They have talked about UFOs in some of their manuals. I don't know how much I've talked about it on this show, but again, lectures and stuff like that. I've talked quite a bit about it. I've got some pages on the Black Vault where you can see they're not afraid to use the phrase UFOs, but they also push you towards the private sector. The National UFO Reporting Center is specifically named, but also Bigelow Aerospace at the time. And that's an interesting story in itself. But Bass was able to get their name, Bigelow Aerospace, into some FAA manuals. They had since disappeared, ironically, around the closure of Project Blue Book, but that all may be a coincidence, of course. Of ATIP, forgive me. But that all may be a coincidence. But that, again, that's a different story. So the FAA is not afraid to use UFOs. However, I thought, well, let's just approach this in a different way. Are there unidentified aircraft policies and stuff like that? And this is where the interesting connection came in. In 2005, there was an incident where a UFO, it was kind of short-lived as a UFO. It ended up being a small commercial plane that was piloted where the pilot was not responding to air traffic control. But he veered off course and he encroached on the airspace of the White House. Now, again, this was an unidentified craft at the time of detection / a UFO. And, jets were scrambled. The White House took evasive action inside the White House to make sure everybody, all the key players were safe. It's safe to say that they've got safe rooms and underground bunkers that they could probably whisk them away to, including stuff that we're not familiar with. So this had actually worked its way into one of the very first television documentaries that I had produced for the History Channel. It was called UFOs in the White House. Now, that's kind of the fun coincidence here, because when I came across this, I had no idea that, here we are 14 years later, and I would be writing about that very incident, including the FAA's response to it, all about unidentified aircraft. Now, the deputy administrator by the name of Robert Sturgill had, and I hope that I have that pronounced correctly, he held a press conference about this very incident at the White House. And it really changed the FAA's approach to what they now termed as unidentified aircraft and how it approached restricted airspace. He said in his press statement that he wanted to make sure that it, quote, was managed efficiently, effectively, and most importantly, safely, of course, punching that safety that safety angle to all of this. I'm going to jump around with quotes, but these are specific quotes from his press statement. Unidentified aircraft operating in restricted airspace are taken very seriously. In the event of a threat from an unidentified aircraft, coordinated action can be taken to appropriately address the threat and keep the region safe. FAA did not know who the aircraft was. They're referring to the 2005 encroachment on the White House airspace. FAA did not know who the aircraft was. At this point, the aircraft was considered to be a track of interest, or what they called a TOI. Now, I haven't really heard of a track of interest before, but it really showed that in 2005, based on a UFO, even though it was identified eventually and quickly, but based on a UFO, the FAA created this press statement, started defining unidentified aircraft, saying that it was being taken very seriously at this point, acknowledged that it was encroaching on restricted airspace in multiple cases, namely this specific one was the White House, and that they called them tracks of interest. In the Federal Aviation Regulations, or FAR, this is also referred to as the Aeronautical Information Manual. This is the 2019 version, and it talks about unidentified aircraft, the same thing that deputy administrator was talking about. And they talk in length and also diagram intercept procedures for unidentified aircraft. Now, again, all of this seems like common sense in today's day and age. Aggressive countries that don't play nice in the sandbox, people using drones for their own personal entertainment, and hobbyists and enthusiasts, the commercial sector getting into drone delivery programs, and Amazon will be flying a small helicopter to your house to drop off a box. All of that is in the future for us, both present and in the future. So is this common sense in the way that they are now approaching aviation safety, or is there something else? And I go back to those links that go back 66 years, connecting the phrasing of unidentified aircraft to flying saucers and the UFO phenomenon that you and I all love and enjoy so much. So I don't put a conclusion here on if the headline is accurate. I just wanted to challenge it. And by doing so, came up with all of these different documents that, in my mind, does actually show an important link between that phrasing, the careful phrasing, and UFOs and flying saucers, going back decades and decades and decades. To me, that's an important link. And all of that evidence goes to more support what is going on here. Now, here's the update on what happened since that Politico story dropped. Now, I went after a statement from the U.S. Navy addressing what had been reported. I wanted to know, is the Navy looking at this saying, yep, that's exactly what we're doing? Or are they looking at it going, this is a over-embellished story? I mean, we're taking unidentified aircraft, seriously, but, this is nothing more because we've had an influx of drones or whatever around our installations. I just wanted to know, was there any type of statement? More so, though, I wanted to make sure that the full statement was out in the open. Because, again, going back to what I said earlier, media doesn't always publish the full statement. And that's not a bash on them. That's just reality. I mean, a lot of times statements are fairly boring. So journalists need to kind of keep everything entertaining and moving along a little bit in their story. So they'll pull bits and pieces of it. So that was the night. I left them a message the night the Politico story dropped. Now, fast forward until Friday morning on the 26th. I had not received any acknowledgement or any update whatsoever. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe they're just not going to respond. And that's okay. You know, I mean, you don't always get what you're looking for, so that's fine. And I received a response. Now, this is from the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Information Warfare. And that is the spokesperson, the office where the spokesperson who is being credited for the statement that was published by Politico, and then the one I got, Joseph Gradisher. Okay, so that he's going to be credited. For those who are looking at the link and you wonder why I'm blurring the contact information and the name of the person that sent me this, it's a courtesy. I just don't, the amount of traffic that my site gets, I just don't like putting people's, unless it's public, I just don't like putting direct contact information so they just don't get inundated. If there's other journalists out there that have their own connections and they write CHINFO, which is the acronym for this particular Navy office, that's fine. There's nothing, I'm not hiding anything here. It's just as a courtesy. So that explains the blurs. But regardless, the person that they asked me to credit the statement to was Joseph Gradisher, spokesperson for Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Information Warfare. Now, in the letter that you can see, this person said, here is the updated statement on this, meaning the UFO Navy guidelines. And I thought, okay, well, updated. Well, it's only been 2 days. Like, what are they updating here? 2 or 3 days. So what's going on? And so I started going line by line from what I had cobbled together between Politico and Washington Post, and then what this updated statement was. And there was only one line that was different. And it was the line that reads, and this is the first one that went out, a new message to the fleet that will detail the steps for reporting is in draft. Now, I haven't talked about this yet, but that was a key line there, because a draft document just means that, draft. It doesn't mean anything is implemented. It doesn't mean anything is sent out to the Navy. It doesn't mean anything is on the books. It just means they're kicking around an idea. It's in draft form. Not to get too technical, another interesting point about drafts is generally, not 100% of the time, but generally draft documents are exempt from the Freedom of Information Act. It's exempted due to what they call B5. So it's in essence, it's a draft document, so it's not official yet. And they're still talking about how it should read on a final draft and then obviously get implemented. So all of those kind of banters back and forth between the powers that be and them deciding, making decisions, changing things, all of that is generally exempted by what they call exemption B5. So draft documents are generally exempt. Yet the line changed. This was the only line that changed, and it said, a message to the fleet details the steps for reporting each incident. No draft language. Not future tense, but present tense. That they actually sent this out. That means that the UFO guidelines, whatever they are now in its final form, and they've already, in the 2-3 days since the Politico article was dropped, it's about 2.5 to be technical, the Politico article was dropped, and in fairness was very accurate. They were saying that they were draft. Not many people picked up on that, at least I don't think. I didn't see a whole lot of people talking about it. They're like, aha, they have procedures. Well, not really as of that day. Now it's safe to say, yes, they probably do. Now, is it the UFO phenomena that we want? I hope so. I put out the historical link. I mean, it's all for you to decide, but that all is very, very encouraging. But the fact that they went out of their way to tell me it's an updated statement and they took the draft language out, that means one of two things. One, the first statement was erroneous and wrong, so they updated it. Fine, credit to them for being accurate. Or in the 2.5 days that Politico dropped that story to when they sent me the updated statement, they finished the draft and sent it out to the fleet. So that brings me to the message itself. Of course, we all want to see that because we want to see what the language is. Does it coincide with the press statement? Does it say UFOs? Does it say phenomena? What does it say? So I wrote this person back from the Navy and specifically asked for the message. Again, in the interest of accuracy for talking about this, and not only on this program, but I've done a couple of interviews since Friday, making sure that I have the story right, and she won't give it to me. They said that they are withholding it. I'm going to go ahead and read the exact response. It says, "We are unable to share the message with you. Due to the operational and aircraft-specific nature of these guidelines, security considerations preclude their disclosure." That's the quote. That was the response I get. They, of course, said thank you, and that was it. So, of course, I don't have the message to give you. That's a bummer. But at least we know now that the message exists. And if there's any question by them taking the draft language out, that they won't, address that, we can now confirm and solidify there is a message. Because indirectly they said, we just can't share that message with you. If the message was still in draft, they may say, well, the message is still being worked on. If there was no message, and I was reading into this, they would say there's no message to give you. And yet they say we are unable to share the message with you. And they give me the reason why, specifically talking about the contents of the message. Now, no news media agency is reporting this yet. They're still talking about all this being draft. So with that being said, at this point, it's exclusive to this program that the Navy guidelines, whatever they are now out there with the fleet. So the question is, how long will it take for an unidentified aircraft report, encounter, case, or whatever to be reported and to be investigated by the Navy? That is up for interpretation. But that is a very, very exciting and encouraging development that did not stay in draft form for 16 years. I was afraid that by reading this and that it was in draft form, they could kick drafts around for a year, 2 years, 5 years. They could do that. They don't need to just implement it because it's in draft today that tomorrow they have to implement it. But what's really interesting is they did in this case, literally within about 2.5 days from that article being reported. I would assume that it's an updated statement and not a corrected statement. Because if it was a mistake and that message had gone out, let's say 6 years ago or 6 months ago, 6 days ago, it doesn't matter, that they would contact and Politico would retract it and they would issue a correction. To Mr. Brian Bender's credit, and I really, really like seeing this, there was a mistake that he had made. We're all human. I make mistakes all the time, so I'm not trying to pick on him. But he made a mistake on the name of what ATIP stood for. It was brought to his attention. They immediately corrected it very, very quickly. That's what journalism is about. Getting the message out there as accurately as possible. And if you're not accurate, then you make a correction. And so my credit to Mr. Brian Bender for doing that. I'm not picking on him for making that mistake. Again, I make 100 times more than he does, I'm sure. But regardless, it's about being accurate. So my credit to him for doing that. I wish more investigative journalists would follow suit. But they be that as it may, what I like to do is bring all that evidence to you. And in the end, despite my opinions on things, you decide. Feel free to place some comments down there. If you're listening on YouTube, you can put this down in the comments there. You can join me on the Black Vault message forums on theblackvault.com, or on Facebook, there's a group as well. Even on Twitter, feel free to use hashtag Black Vault. Sound off. Even if you don't agree with me, I'm fine with that. There's quite a few people that don't, but that's okay. I love interesting dialogue, and I appreciate you all listening. Until next time. This is John Greenewald Jr. signing off. We'll see you then.